Hi friends, in this lecture we'll discuss in detail about infective endocarditis. We'll first go through the intro, then epidemiology, what is the idiopathogenesis of this condition, what are the cardiac and some extra cardiac manifestations we'll discuss after that, how diagnosis is made, there was earlier Duke's criteria and how it is different from modified Duke's criteria which is currently being followed. What is the treatment of this condition, including what all antibiotics are used, what are the indications of cardiac surgery, and finally we'll discuss the outcome and prevention of this condition. So before going in depth, we need to know that there are three layers covering the heart. These are the atria, then we have ventricles, these are atrioventricular septum. The layers include endocardium, myocardium and pericardium. So endocardium has further two parts. The one surrounding the cavity is known as mural endocardium and the one around the walls is known as valvular endocardium. So if this valvular endocardium is involved due to any infection, it is termed as infective endocarditis. So it is the infection of valvular endocardium, be it either in native valve or prosthetic valve, that is artificial valve which is implanted in the patient due to any particular disease of the native valve, or there is infection of an intracardiac device. If infection of either valvular endocardium or the intracardiac device occurs, it is termed as infective endocarditis. Now, the vegetation is a prototypic lesion of infective endocarditis and consists of mass of platelets, fibrin, microorganisms and few inflammatory cells. Now, infection usually affects the heart walls but can also affect low pressure side of the VSD. Low pressure side of VSD. So most commonly the flow of VSD is from left to right side. So right side of the VSD can be affected, which is the low pressure side. Then it can also affect damaged mural endocardium. Usually it affects valvular endocardium as we have discussed, but if there is damage at any level of mural endocardium, this can also be affected. And as we discussed, it can also affect intracardiac devices. Now, what is infective endarthritis? Now, it is a similar process to infective endocarditis, but if it occurs in AV shunts, that is arteriovenous shunts, arterial shunts like PDA, or in coarctation of aorta. Coarctation of aorta. This is termed as infective endarthritis. Now let's come on to the classification of infective endocarditis. So it can be classified by various ways. First, as per the temporal evolution of the disease into acute infective endocarditis and subacute. Now acute infective endocarditis is almost 100% fatal, while subacute has a good prognosis. It has survival rate of about 80 to 90%. Now this can be classified according to the valve affected, whether native valve or prosthetic valve, according to the predisposing risk factor like people who inject drugs or healthcare associated infective endocarditis, and finally according to the cause of infection. Coming on to epidemiology. So in developed countries like United States, estimated incidence of infective endocarditis is around 12 cases per 1 lakh population per year. Now, there is an increasing trend for this condition. When we consider the predisposing conditions, these have shifted from earlier. Rheumatic heart disease was the most common predisposing conditions which affected individuals less than 30 years of age. And among those individuals, mitral valve was commonly affected, followed by aortic valve. but now this incidence has shifted more towards more than 50 years of age due to degenerative wall disease. Since there is better treatment, better antibiotic therapy for rheumatic heart disease, the incidence has declined, and now the predisposing conditions are more commonly degenerative wall disease, especially in more than 50 years of age, people who inject drug, and intracardiac devices. So now elderly population are more commonly affected by infective endocarditis than young patients. Among congenital causes, mitral valve prolapse with mitral regurgitation is the most common risk factor. Now, prosthetic valve endocarditis accounts for 16 to 30% of the all cases. Risk is especially highest in the first year after valve replacement, especially for bioprosthetic valves as compared to the mechanical valves. So this is the condition in which being implanted with bioprosthetic valve makes the patient at risk for development of this condition. When we consider the etiology, several bacterial species are implicated in majority of infective endocarditis cases. For native valve endocarditis, most common organism is Staph aureus, which is typically methicillin resistant. This is followed by Streptococcus viridans, which originates from the throat of the patient, followed by Enterococcus, which arises from genitourinary tract. Hecac organisms, that is Haemophilus, Actinomycetes, Cardiobacterium hominis, Eikenella corrodens, and Kingella kingi. These are less common causes of infective endocarditis, and these usually arises from the respiratory tract of the patient. Streptococcus galolyticus originates from gastrointestinal tract and is linked to colonic polyps and tumors. When we consider healthcare associated endocarditis, it is often caused by Staph aureus, Coagulase negative Staphylococcus, and Enterococcus. So this is important for healthcare associated infective endocarditis. For people who inject drugs, Staph aureus is the most common cause, and this usually affects tricuspid valve, that is right-sided endocarditis. So this was about native valve endocarditis. Now let's discuss the various organisms implicated in prosthetic valve endocarditis or patients with intracardiac devices. So early prosthetic valve endocarditis, that is within 2 months of valve placement, is generally due to nosocomial infection, that is intraoperative contamination. The organisms implicated are Staph aureus, Coagulase negative Staphylococcus, Gram negative bacilli, diphtheroids, as well as fungus. For late PV, that is more than 12 months after surgery, the causative organisms are similar to community acquired native valve endocarditis. So the most common organism will be Staphylococcus followed by Streptococcus viridans, then Enterococcus is also implicated. Now transcatheter aortic valve replacement patients have similar organisms to prosthetic valve endocarditis, but there is increased frequency of Enterococcus associated endocarditis. For patients with cardiovascular implantable electronic devices, most common implicated organisms are Staph aureus and Coagulase negative Staphylococcus. So these were the organisms implicated in native valve as well as prosthetic valve endocarditis. So we have to remember the important points. Firstly, most common organism is Staph aureus followed by Streptococcus viridans and Enterococcus, both in native valve and late prosthetic valve endocarditis. The early prosthetic valve endocarditis is usually due to nosocomial infection, and in healthcare or nosocomial infection, we have role of Coagulase negative Staphylococcus. Now, approximately 5 to 15% of patients of infective endocarditis have negative blood cultures, which can be due to either prior antibiotic exposure. If the patient has prior antibiotic exposure, or infection with a fastidious organism. Fastidious organism means that do not grow in routine culture. So what are the examples of these fastidious organisms? These include some species of Streptococcus, Granulicatella, Abiotrophia, Haeckel group of organisms, Coxiella burnetii, Bartonella, and Trophirima whipple. Now it is important to note that there are certain conditions mimicking culture negative infective endocarditis. What are these conditions? Atrial myxoma can be confused. Then merantic endocarditis. Merantic endocarditis is associated with hypercoagulability states like cancer, autoimmune diseases, or HIV. And finally, antiphospholipid antibody syndrome. So these conditions can mimic culture negative infective endocarditis and should be kept in their differential diagnosis. Now let's discuss a very important part, that is pathogenesis of infective endocarditis. First of all, as we all know, healthy endocardium is resistant to most bacterial infections during bacteremia. But when there is endothelial injury, either from high velocity blood jets or low pressure side of cardiac structural lesion, on the low pressure side of any cardiac structural lesion like VSD, it creates a vulnerable site for infection. Now, this injury allows either a direct infection by the virulent organism or leads to formation of a platelet fibrin thrombus known as non-bacterial thrombotic endocarditis. Now, this non-bacterial thrombotic endocarditis acts as a site for bacterial attachment during transient bacteremia. Cardiac conditions that commonly lead to this condition include mitral regurgitation, aortic stenosis, VSD, or any complex congenital heart disease. So these individuals are at risk for development of non-bacterial thrombotic endocarditis. Now, if bacteremia develops in such patient due to any dental procedure, any abscess elsewhere in the body, or traumatic mucosal erosion, this bacteria reaches the damaged endocardium and there occurs bacterial adhesion to the non-bacterial thrombotic endocarditis site via microbial surface components recognizing adhesion matrix molecules. So this is the short form of these molecules. Now, adhesion is further facilitated by certain proteins on different bacteria like fibronectin binding protein, clumping factor which is present on Staphylococcus, fibrogen binding protein, collagen binding protein, glucans or FIM-A which is present on Streptococcus. Adherent organisms proliferate and form infected vegetations, that is, they will form bacterial endocarditis. This non-bacterial endocarditis now become infected to form bacterial endocarditis, and there will be continuous shedding of this vegetation into the bloodstream. Now, it is important to note that these bacterial vegetations are metabolically inactive. Therefore, these are resistant to routine antibiotics, routine dose and duration of antibiotics. Since there is no special blood supply for these bacterial and vegetations, there will be metabolic inactiveness in this endocarditis. Now, after we have discussed the pathogenesis, let's move on to the clinical manifestations of endocarditis. So first let's differentiate the clinical manifestations of acute from subacute infective endocarditis. So acute usually occurs due to infection by beta hemolytic streptococcus, Staphylococcus aureus and pneumococcus, while subacute is due to infection by Streptococcus viridans, Enterococcus, Coagulase negative Staphylococcus and Haeckel group of organisms. Acute is associated with very high grade fever. On the other hand, in subacute, the fever is low grade and usually less than 39.4 degree centigrade. Acute infective endocarditis usually affects the normal valves, so it can occur in even a healthy individual, while subacute usually affects damaged valves except in patients who inject drugs. In this, a normal tricuspid valve can also be affected. Acute infective endocarditis usually occurs due to hematogenous seeding from a resistant infection at a different site, like MRSA from osteomyelitis, while subacute occurs due to bacteremia due to dental procedure, etc., the classical pathogenesis which we have discussed in the previous slide. Now this subacute infective endocarditis, according to the clinical manifestations, is further divided into left-sided infective endocarditis and right-sided. So we will first discuss the left-sided infective endocarditis. What are the clinical features of this condition? So this usually presents with fever for 1 to 2 weeks. Patient will complain of anorexia, malaise, associated chills, myalgia and arthralgia. Now what are the specific major features? There will be a new onset murmur or worsening of a previously present murmur. Now why this murmur is occurring? Because of valvular damage, congestive heart failure or intracardiac fistula formation due to endocarditis. Heart block can develop especially in aortic paravalvular infection, which can burrow into upper ventricular septum leading to heart block. There can be features of arterial embolization, like patient can present with stroke, both ischemic as well as hemorrhagic. If coronary arteries are blocked, the patient can land up into acute coronary syndrome, which is seen in about 2% of the patients. If renal arteries are embolized, then it will lead to renal infarction, as well as ophthalmic artery can involve, leading to endophthalmitis. The clinical features of microembolization can be seen in the form of petechial hemorrhage and splinter hemorrhage, typically in the nail beds. Other than this, clubbing and splenomegaly are also common in infective endocarditis. Now, when we consider right-sided endocarditis, in addition to cardiac features, microembolization can occur into the lungs, leading to pulmonary symptoms and features of right heart failure. Now, what can be the various peripheral manifestations? These include petechiae, which are most commonly found on palpebral conjunctiva, buccal and palatal mucosa, as well as can be seen on extremities. Splinter hemorrhage, which is common on nail bed, can be seen as a peripheral manifestation. Then there are two specific lesions associated, that is Janeway lesions and ossular nodes. So Janeway lesions are common in acute infective endocarditis. These are basically the septic emboli resulting in non-tender macular erythematous rash, typically seen on sole, palms and thenar eminence. This will be non-tender. This is an important point. On the other hand, ossular nodes are common in subacute infective endocarditis, and these are typically due to immune complex mediated phenomena. Therefore, these are painful tender nodules on fingers and toe. Other than this, hematogenous seeding of focal infection can occur in various organs like skin, spleen, kidney, skeletal system as well as meninges. There can be regional pain and ischemia-induced organ dysfunction. Renal complications include hypocomplementic glomerulonephritis as well as renal dysfunction, which typically improves with conservative therapy. In people who inject drugs, septic pulmonary emboli can occur from the right side because this condition typically involves the tricuspid valve. So this is the table showing various symptoms, signs as well as lab manifestation. So when we consider the symptom, the most common symptom is fever, which is present in 80 to 90% of the cases, followed by chills and sweats. Then patients have anorexia, weight loss, malaise, myalgias, arthralgias as well as back pain. When we consider the most common sign, it is the presence of heart murmur. Presence of murmur, which is present in 80 to 85% of the patients. Then there can be features of arterial emboli, splenomegaly, clubbing. These are rare neurological complications. And it is important to note that peripheral complications like Osler node, subungual hemorrhages, Janeway lesions, Roth spots, these are rare. These are seen only in 2 to 15% of the cases. So we do not search for these findings in each and every case of infective endocarditis. Among lab manifestations, anemia is common. Then patient have leukocytosis, microscopic hematuria is associated with this condition. Then elevated ESR and elevated CRP is seen in almost each and every patient. 50% of the patients have positive rheumatoid factor. Then circulating immune complexes are there and there will be hypocomplementemia. Now this is the image showing Janeway lesions. These are the macular rashes which are non-tender, typically seen on fingers, palms and soles, and these are common in acute infective endocarditis. This is due to septic emboli. These are just the septic embolization of the thrombus which has formed in the heart. Then these are splinter hemorrhages, which is again the septic emboli. Then Osler nodes, these are due to immune complex phenomena, common in subacute, and these will be present on finger pulp and typically these are tender. So these are the various peripheral manifestations of infective endocarditis. Now let's discuss how to diagnose this condition. So earlier, Duke's criteria which was used Duke's criteria which was used suggested that So according to the earlier used Duke's criteria, the definitive diagnosis of infective endocarditis requires the histological and microbiological examination of the vegetations, which is not possible in each and every case. Therefore, there was modification done in this criteria. Now, modified Duke's criteria is used. It is based on clinical, laboratory and echocardiographic findings which are common in infective endocarditis patients. So in patients with potential infective endocarditis predispositions, cardiac or non-cardiac features of infective endocarditis like stroke, splenic infarct if present, or blood cultures if yielding infective endocarditis associated organisms, a thorough clinical, microbiological and echocardiographic evaluation is essential in these patients. Now we'll discuss later in the slides that there are 2 major criteria and 5 minor criteria for diagnosis of infective endocarditis. The 2 major criteria are based on blood culture and echocardiography. So let's discuss the blood culture. So firstly, the patients of which infective endocarditis is suspected, if we are taking the sample for blood culture, ideally the patient should not have received the antibiotics in prior 2 weeks. So how do we take the sample? 3 sets we have to take, each containing 2 bottles of blood culture. So 3 2-bottle blood culture sets have to be taken from different sites, from different venipuncture sites. So we have 6 samples total. Suppose this is from site 1, this is from site 2 and this is from site 3. Now these samples have to be taken over a period of 1 to 2 hours. And this whole procedure we have to repeat after 18 to 24 hours. Again we will take the 6 samples. So this is how samples are to be taken. For patients who are in sepsis or have deteriorating hemodynamics, we have to immediately start empirical antibiotics just after taking the sample. Now what is positive culture result? So for typical organisms like Streptococcus viridans, Staph aureus, Enterococcus, if 2 out of 3 samples are positive, if 2 out of 3 samples, so this is sample 1, sample 2, sample 3. If 2 out of 3 are positive, we consider this as culture positive. For atypical organisms, which are some of the fastidious organisms, this sample should be persistently positive even after 18 to 24 hours. So suppose 2 out of 3 samples are positive in the first testing, then again we have tested after 18 to 24 hours, this should again be positive. So this is for atypical organisms. But exception is Coxiella burnetii. Even if single sample is positive or IgG antibody test is positive, we consider it as positive for Coxiella burnetii. Now other than blood culture, we have certain non-blood culture tests like serological test, which can help identify organisms that are challenging to recover by culture, such as Brucella, Bartonella, Coxiella burnetii. So antibody test is used for Coxiella burnetii, Trophirima, Whipple, etc. Now organisms in surgically recovered vegetations can be identified by culture or histopathological examination using special stains, as well as molecular testing like polymerase chain reaction. This molecular testing can particularly be useful when tissue sample is limited and should be prioritized over the culture. So among the major criteria, we have blood culture and echocardiography. We have discussed blood culture. Let's now discuss echocardiography. So it is crucial for anatomically confirming and measuring the vegetations, detecting any intracardiac complications, and assessing cardiac function. So in cardiac imaging, transthoracic echo is highly specific but may yield inadequate images in 20% of the patients. So in 20% of the patient, this transthoracic echo do not give good images, inadequate images. So when we consider the sensitivity is more for transesophageal echocardiography as compared to transthoracic echo. What are the positive echo findings which are considered in diagnosis? So presence of vegetations, presence of an abscess, new onset valve regurgitation, or new partial dehiscence of a prosthetic valve. If any of this finding is present on echo, it will be considered as positive echo finding. Now let's here only discuss what are the indications specially for transesophageal echo. We have to do transesophageal echo in certain conditions. If the patient already is known to have prosthetic valves or any cardiac electronic device, presence of perivalvular abscess is there, valvular perforation is suspected, if vegetation size is less than 2 mm on transthoracic echo, or presence of fistula, we have definitely follow transthoracic echo with transesophageal echo. So these are the specific indications for transesophageal echocardiography. Now after we have some background of blood culture, testing and cardiac imaging, let's discuss the detailed modified Duke's criteria. So as we discussed, we have two major criteria. First is positive blood culture and second is evidence of endocardial involvement, and then we have 5 minor criteria. So positive blood culture, this positive blood culture, if typical microorganism for infective endocarditis is considered, this should be positive from 2 separate blood cultures. So the samples which we have taken, 3 samples we have taken from 3 different sites, total 6 samples. So 2 should be positive out of the 3. So what are the typical organisms? Streptococcus viridans, Streptococcus galeolyticus, Haeckel group of organisms, Staph aureus as well as Comte acquired enterococci in the absence of any other primary focus. So this is the blood culture criteria for typical organisms. Next is for atypical organisms. So for atypical organisms, this should be persistently positive blood culture, defined as recovery of microorganisms consistent with infective endocarditis from blood cultures drawn more than 12 hours apart. So we know that we repeat samples after 18 to 24 hours, sometimes after 12 hours. So if the second time also the bacteria is growing, then it will be positive for blood culture. Or the three samples which we are taking initially from 3 sites, all of these are positive, then also we can consider this atypical organisms, but first and last sample should be drawn at least 1 hour apart. So we take these samples in a duration of 1 to 2 hours, but it is to be kept in mind that first and third site should be taken after 1 hour. Or for Coxiella burnetii, we have discussed it is an exception. Only single positive blood culture or even IgG antibody testing with more than 1:800 titer is considered positive. So this was about blood culture. Now let's discuss about endocardial involvement. So what is positive echocardiography finding? If there is oscillating intracardiac mass on wall or any supporting structures or in the path of regurgitant jets or in the implanted material in the absence of an alternative anatomic explanation. So this is basically a presence of vegetation, then presence of an abscess, new partial dehiscence of prosthetic wall or new valvular regurgitation, whether increase or change in pre-existing murmur is not sufficient to consider in this echocardiographic finding. There should be new valvular regurgitation which should be found. So this is the major criteria. Now among minor criteria, if the patient has a predisposing condition, predisposing heart condition, or is injecting drug, what can be the predisposing conditions? Any valvular stenosis or regurgitation, presence of prosthetic wall, congenital heart disease, prior endocarditis, or hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. These are the various predisposing heart conditions. Second minor criteria is fever more than 38 degrees centigrade or more than 100.4 degree Fahrenheit, presence of vascular phenomena like major arterial emboli, septic pulmonary infarcts, mycotic aneurysm, intracranial hemorrhage, conjunctival hemorrhages, and Janeway lesion. Immunological phenomena like glomerulonephritis, osseous nodes, Roth spots, and rheumatoid factor. So it is important to note that Janeway lesion is due to vascular phenomena, while osseous node, Roth spots, positive rheumatoid factor, and glomerulonephritis is immunological phenomena associated with infective endocarditis. Finally, microbiological evidence, the positive blood culture which is not meeting the major criteria, as we have discussed in this major criteria, or serologic evidence of active infection with an organism consistent with infective endocarditis. So except for Coxiella burnetii, if any other rare organism is coming into serology, it will be considered in minor criteria. So this positive blood culture which is not meeting the major criteria also has exceptions. So single positive blood culture for Coagulase negative Staphylococcus and diphtheroids, this will not be considered even in minor criteria, and gram negative bacilli, if these are grown in single culture, these will not be considered in the minor criteria because these are the common contaminants. These are common contaminants. If Staphylococcus, Streptococcus viridans, Haeckel group of organisms, these are growing even in single culture, these will be considered in minor criteria, not Coagulase negative Staphylococcus, diphtheroid, or gram negative. These will not be considered. So this is the detail of modified Duke's criteria. So for diagnosis of definite infective endocarditis, Either both of the major criteria should be fulfilled, or one major along with 3 minor criteria should be fulfilled, or all of the 5 minor criteria should be fulfilled. This will mark it as definite infective endocarditis. Now, rejection of diagnosis can be done if an alternative diagnosis is made at any point of time. We have an alternative diagnosis, or if the symptoms resolve, there is no fever, patient has no murmur now, within 4 days of antibiotic therapy. If symptoms resolve within 4 days of antibiotic therapy, or if the histological evidence is absent, on surgery or autopsy within 4 days of antibiotic therapy. So if any of this is present, we will reject the diagnosis of infective endocarditis. Now, the cases which are not classified in either definite infective endocarditis, neither these are rejected. These will be considered as possible infective endocarditis. So when they meet one major along with one minor criteria, or 3 minor criteria are present, these will be possible infective endocarditis. It is important to note that both definite and possible infective endocarditis both are treated as infective endocarditis. Now, other imaging tests which are helpful include cardiac CT angiogram, which may particularly be helpful in detecting vegetations, especially associated with paravalvular infection. Paravalvular infection, especially along the aortic wall, can lead to heart blocks. Then 18 FDG PETs can be valuable, especially in cases of suspected prosthetic wall endocarditis or presence of extracardiac complication. Then brain MRI or MR angiography is essential for assessing any emboli, hemorrhage or mycotic aneurysms in patients with neurological signs or symptoms. Now, as we have already discussed, other lab tests include, in CBC we can find out anemia, leukocytosis, rarely thrombocytopenia is present, ESR and CRP is raised in almost every patient, RA factor is raised in about 50% of the patients, and we can see proteinuria and microscopic hematuria with normal renal function due to MPGN, which is hypocomplementic glomerulonephritis. Now, this flowchart will help you understanding the indications of transthoracic and transesophageal echocardiography. So, if a patient comes who has suspected infective endocarditis, if on examination he is a high risk patient. So, what is a high risk patient? If there is new regurgitant murmur on examination, new ECG conduction defect, or presence of congestive heart failure, symptoms and signs of CHF, then this patient is high risk patient. So moderate to high clinical suspicion or patient is difficult imaging candidate. If we know that patient already has prosthetic valves or any cardiac electronic device implanted, then we will directly go for transesophageal echocardiography. If it is positive, then we will start treatment for infective endocarditis and will do follow-up echocardiography to reassess the vegetations, complications or treatment response as clinically indicated. Now, if this initial transesophageal echocardiography is negative, but still we have high suspicion, then we will repeat again this echocardiography. If it is positive, we will start treatment, again follow up. If it is negative, we will consider CT angiography or FDG PET. If this comes out to be positive, treatment. If negative, then we will clinically judge whether treatment is required or not. We will consider whether it is coming in possible infective endocarditis category or any other diagnosis is established which will reject the diagnosis of infective endocarditis. If initial TE is negative, we look for other source of symptoms. If it is present, we can very well make alternative diagnosis. If no other source of symptoms is found out, we'll again repeat the transesophageal echo. If initially the patient is low, there is no regurgitant murmur, no conduction defect, no features of CHF, we will initially go for transthoracic echo. Now, if this transthoracic echo is positive, we will start the patient on treatment. If there are high risk features on transthoracic echo, what are these high risk features? Presence of large vegetations, very large vegetations, any valve insufficiency, paravalvular infection, which can lead to conduction defect, or any ventricular dysfunction. The ejection fraction of the patient is decreasing. We have to go for transesophageal echo for detection of these complications and then follow up again. If there are no high risk features, there is no need for transesophageal echo unless clinical status of this patient deteriorates. If the initial transthoracic echo is negative and there is increased suspicion during the clinical course, we will go for transesophageal echo. If positive, go for treatment. If there is low suspicion or transesophageal echo is negative, we will look for other source for the symptoms the patient is presenting with. So this is the flowchart which will simplify the indications of transthoracic and transesophageal echocardiography. Now coming on to one of the most important part of this presentation, that is treatment. So treating infective endocarditis successfully is challenging because, as we have discussed, that bacteria within vegetation are largely non-growing and metabolically inactive. This makes them less susceptible to antibiotics. Therefore, therapy has to be bactericidal and prolonged. Now, antibiotics are administered parenterally to achieve the effective serum concentrations that can penetrate the depths of the vegetation through passive diffusion. Empirical treatment initiation is required in most of the cases before we get the culture sensitivity results. So before going into the specific treatment of organisms, let's discuss the empirical therapy and treatment of culture negative infective endocarditis. If culture results are negative, what treatment would we start? So empirical therapy should be designed based on the clinical and epidemiological clues. For acute infective endocarditis, empirical therapy should cover methicillin resistance, Staph aureus, especially in cases of healthcare associated native valve endocarditis or people who inject drugs in which MRSA is the most common cause. So we have to add vancomycin in the regimen. For native valve endocarditis with subacute presentation, we can include vancomycin, which will again give the gram-positive coverage, along with ceftriaxone, which will cover gram-negative bacteria. For blood culture pending prosthetic valve endocarditis within 12 months of surgery, we will add vancomycin, which will give gram-positive coverage, also will cover MRSA. Along with this, we will add gentamicin and cefepime. These are the broad spectrum antibiotics, have varying gram-positive, gram-negative, including pseudomonas coverage. So this is the rationale behind using the three drugs. Now let's come on to the treatment of individual bacteria. So first let's consider streptococcal infective endocarditis. So therapy for this bacteria depends on minimal inhibitory concentration of penicillin for that causative isolate. So accordingly, this can be divided into penicillin susceptible streptococci along with Streptococcus galolyticus with MIC less than 0.12 microgram per ml. So MIC less than 0.12 microgram per ml. Then second class is MIC between 0.12 to 0.5 microgram per ml, and third class is 0.5 to 8 microgram per ml. Along with this, there are certain fastidious organisms which, if positive in serology, will also be treated along with this regimen. So these are Granulicatella, Abiotrophia or Gamelia species. So let's first discuss for MIC less than 0.12. So if single antibiotic is used, the course of antibiotic will be 4 weeks. If dual antibiotic is used, the course will be 2 weeks. So for singly, we can give penicillin G 2 to 3 million units intravenously every 4 hours for 4 weeks. We can use alternatively ampicillin or amoxicillin if penicillin is unavailable. If there is penicillin allergy which is very common, we have two alternatives. For non-immediate penicillin allergy, we can give ceftriaxone, which can be given as 2 gram daily as single dose for 4 weeks. On the other hand, the patients who have immediate or severe penicillin allergy, these can be given vancomycin in a dose of 15 mg per kg IV every 12 hours for 4 weeks. So this was about single drug therapy. If we are giving dual agents, the therapy will be for 2 weeks. So we can combine either penicillin G in the same dose or ceftriaxone in the same dose which we have discussed along with gentamicin. Now gentamicin can be given 3 mg per daily IV or IM as a single dose, or if it is to be divided into the equal doses, the doses will come out to be 1 mg per kg every 8 hourly. Now this gentamicin is limited to 2 weeks in most of the cases to minimize the nephrotoxicity. Also, we avoid this 2-week regimen when there is risk of aminoglycoside toxicity and in patients who have prosthetic valve or complicated endocarditis. It is to be kept in mind, for prosthetic valve endocarditis, a 6-week regimen is preferred over 4-week regimen. Now second is when there is relatively penicillin resistant, that is MIC is between 0.12 to 5. Now there is no role of single penicillin giving penicillin or ceftriaxone alone. In this case, there will be no role of giving penicillin or ceftriaxone alone. But still we can give vancomycin singly. So if we are giving single drug, now the regimen will be of 6 weeks. Dual drug, the regimen will be 4 weeks. So penicillin and ceftriaxone will be given for 4 weeks. And again gentamicin will be given for 2 weeks, which is given to decrease the initial bacteremia, and it is limited to 2 weeks for avoiding any toxicity. So we are trying to simplify things so that these are easy to remember. So if the single dose is given, vancomycin in the same dose for 6 weeks, this is preferred for patients with immediate or severe penicillin allergy. If dual antibiotic is given, penicillin, now we have also increased the dose 4 million international unit every 4 hourly, or ceftriaxone in the same dose, that is 2 gram daily for 4 weeks. Along with this, gentamicin in the same dose for 2 weeks. This is the regimen for MIC between 0.12 to 0.5. We can prefer ampicillin or amoxicillin if it is available. And now the patients who have prosthetic valve implanted with MIC less than 0.2, we can prefer this regimen for such patients, which has to be given for total 6 weeks. But in 6 weeks, the gentamicin will still be given only for 2 weeks. Finally, if the MIC is more than 0.5, then we can give either single drug or dual drug. Now both single as well as dual drug would be given for 6 weeks. So singly we can give vancomycin as we have discussed in the above table. In dual drug we can give penicillin G. Now the dose has further increased to 4 to 5 million international unit every 4 hourly. Ceftriaxone same dose for 6 weeks. But in this case gentamicin will also be given for 6 weeks. Now till now we have discussed that gentamicin was being given for 2 weeks, but now we are giving gentamicin also for 6 weeks. So this regimen will be preferred for prosthetic valve endocarditis with MIC 0.12 to 0.5, and this will be continued for 6 weeks in that case. So after we have discussed treatment of streptococcus, let's move on to the treatment of enterococcus. So in this case, no single drug is used, only dual therapy is used. Only dual therapy is being used, and duration is 4 to 6 weeks. 4 to 6 weeks. So if penicillin G is used, it is used in the dose 4 to 5 million unit every 4 hourly, along with gentamicin 1 milligram per kg every 8 hourly, both for 4 to 6 weeks. So for native valve endocarditis, we prefer treatment for 4 weeks if the symptoms last for less than 3 months. But if symptoms last for more than 3 months, we will treat for 6 weeks. Similarly, for prosthetic valve endocarditis, 6-week regimens are always preferred. Alternatively, instead of penicillin, we can combine ampicillin with gentamicin. Also, we can alternatively use amoxicillin. Vancomycin can be combined with gentamicin in the same dose for 6 weeks. This is especially for penicillin allergic patients. Finally, ampicillin along with ceftriaxone can be combined, especially for Enterococcus faecalis isolates which have high level resistance to gentamicin, or there is increased risk for amyloglycoside nephrotoxicity. Coming on to treatment of staphylococcus. So staphylococcus treatment depends on factors like whether there is presence of native valve or prosthetic valve, as well as antibiotic susceptibility. Antibiotic susceptibility. So accordingly, this can be divided into native valve endocarditis and prosthetic valve endocarditis. In these, there will be further MMSA, that is methicillin sensitive strains, and MRSA. So it is to be kept in mind that native valve endocarditis should be treated for 6 weeks for both MSSA as well as MRSA, while prosthetic valve endocarditis is usually treated for 6 to 8 weeks for both MSSA as well as MRSA. So let's first discuss native valve endocarditis by MSSA. So since this is methicillin sensitive, we can give nafcillin, oxacillin, fluoxacillin for 6 weeks. Alternatively, we can go for cefazolin. Also, we can give vancomycin. So vancomycin in this case is not being used for MRSA, but is being used for patients with immediate or severe penicillin allergy. For MRSA, we have to go only for vancomycin, or we can go for daptomycin. The dose of daptomycin is 8 to 10 milligram per kg daily. There is no role of rifampin in this case, which we will discuss, will be used in prosthetic valve endocarditis. Now for prosthetic valve endocarditis, if MSSA is there, again nafcillin, oxacillin plus fluoxacillin. Along with this, gentamicin will be given for 2 weeks. This is for bacteremia, reduce initial bacteremia, and along with this, we will also give rifampin. Now, what is the rationale for giving rifampin? This will kill staphylococcus embedded in biofilm which is adherent to the foreign material like prosthetic valve. So rifampin is given for biofilm. If there is MRSA, we cannot give nafcillin, oxacillin. We have to combine vancomycin along with gentamicin, and rifampin. Rifampin is given for 6 to 8 weeks, gentamicin only for initial 2 weeks. Daptomycin can be considered as an alternative to vancomycin, but data is still limited about this. So we have discussed treatment of Streptococcus, Enterococcus and Staphylococcus, which are the 3 most common organisms. Now for treatment of Haeckel group, firstly treatment will last for 4 weeks. We can either go for ceftriaxone 2 gram daily for 4 weeks or ampicillin sulbactam combination for 4 weeks. For Coxiella burnetii, the treatment of Q fever, if Q fever is there, it is usually treated for 12 months with the same drugs which we are going to discuss. But if it has led to endocarditis, the treatment will last for at least 18 months. 18 months. This is a very important point. The treatment is done by doxycycline, which is given 100 mg BD plus hydroxychloroquine, which is given 200 mg TDS for both at least 18 months for native valve and 24 months for prosthetic valve. This is a very important question. Simultaneously, we follow serology to monitor response during the treatment, that is IgG antibody and Ig antibody, which are decreased 4-fold, and IgM antibody becomes negative, and also monitor this for relapse. For Bartonella, we give doxycycline 100 mg BD for 6 weeks, gentamicin again 1 mg per kg TDS for 2 weeks. If doxycycline is not tolerated, alternatively we can use azithromycin 500 mg OD. Now let's discuss the treatment of other rare organisms. So for Streptococcus pneumoniae, the infective endocarditis caused by this bacteria isolates with a penicillin minimal inhibitory concentration of less than equal to 4 microgram per ml can be treated with either IV penicillin in a dose of 4 million unit every 4 hourly or ceftriaxone 2 gram daily or vancomycin 15 milligram per kg every 12 hourly. Especially if the MIC is more than 2, ceftriaxone and vancomycin are preferred for MIC more than 2. If there is suspected meningitis, we add ceftriaxone and vancomycin both to cover both gram positive and gram negative. For native valve endocarditis, the total duration of treatment is 4 weeks. For prosthetic valve, the total duration is 6 weeks. For treatment of Pseudomonas aeruginosa, we can give anti-Pseudomonas cephalosporin like ceftazidime along with high dose tobramycin, that is 8 mg per kg per day in 3 divided doses. For enterobacterial infective endocarditis, we give combination of beta-lactam along with aminoglycoside. For corynebacterial endocarditis, we can either use penicillin along with aminoglycoside combination if the organism is susceptible to aminoglycoside. Alternatively, we can go for vancomycin. Now for Candida, the treatment usually consists of lipid formulation amphotericin B in a dose of 3 to 5 mg per kg IV daily with or without flucytosine, which is given 25 mg per kg per orally every 6 hours. Alternatively, we can go for high dose echinocandins. Early surgery is required in fungal endocarditis if there is valve dysfunction or prosthetic valve endocarditis. Now, how do we monitor therapy? So, we have to do blood tests to detect the toxicity, which should be performed periodically. Especially aminoglycosides and vancomycin serum concentration monitoring is done for dose adjustments. We have to control the peripheral sites of infection promptly. Blood culture should be repeated until sterile. Vegetations usually become smaller with effective therapy, but this is not necessary. After we have discussed antimicrobial therapy in treatment, now let's consider the indications of surgery. First of all, decision for cardiac surgery should be individualized based on the patient's condition. It is important to note that about 25 to 40% of the patients with left-sided infective endocarditis require cardiac surgery. This is particularly during acute infection with higher rates for prosthetic valve endocarditis more than native valve endocarditis. We have to always consider survival benefit versus mortality risk which is associated with the cardiac surgery. So this table shows all the indications of cardiac surgery in the patients of endocarditis. So first class is surgery required for optimum outcome. So this can be considered as absolute indications. This can be considered as absolute indications. While surgery to be strongly considered for improved outcome, this can be considered as relative indications of cardiac surgery. So absolute indication in native valve or prosthetic valve endocarditis includes if the patient has moderate or severe congestive heart failure or shock due to valve dysfunction, if there is paravalvular extension of infection with abscess, fistula, which can lead to heart block, persistent bacteremia without an extracardiac cause despite 7 to 10 days of optimal antimicrobial therapy, lack of effective antimicrobial therapy for organisms like fungus, brucella, MDR gram-negative bacillary endocarditis. Now, especially for prosthetic valve endocarditis, partially dehisced unstable prosthetic valve and paravalvular extension of infection are the absolute indications of surgery. Now, relative indications for prosthetic valve endocarditis include Staph aureus infection with intracardiac complications and relapse after optimal antimicrobial therapy. For native valve endocarditis, large vegetations which are hypermobile, particularly with prior systemic embolus, significant valve dysfunction, very large vegetation more than 30 mm, persistent unexplained fever more than 10 days in blood culture negative endocarditis, and poorly responsive or relapsed endocarditis due to high antibiotic resistant enterococcus or gram negative bacilli. So these are the various indications of cardiac surgery and they should be remembered by heart. Now, along with indications, we also need to know importance of timing of cardiac surgery. So there can be certain emergent indications which has to be the cardiac surgery has to be done in same day. Certain urgent indications, surgery to be done in 1 to 2 days, and certain indications in which elective cardiac surgery can be performed. So emergent indications include valve dysfunction with pulmonary edema or cardiogenic shock, acute AR plus pre-closure of mitral valve, sinus of Valsalva abscess ruptured into right heart or rupture into the pericardial sac. The urgent indications include valve obstruction by vegetation, unstable prosthesis, acute AR or MR with heart failure, septal perforation, paravalvular extension of infection, and lack of effective antibiotic therapy. Elective indications can be remembered as progressive paravalvular prosthetic regurgitation, valve dysfunction plus persisting infection after 7 to 10 days of antimicrobial therapy, and fungal endocarditis. So question can be formulated like which of the following is an elective indication? The option will be present like fungal endocarditis. So this is again an important table. Now before going on to the outcome and prevention of endocarditis, let's discuss two important extracardiac complications. Extracardiac complications. So first one is splenic abscess. For treatment of which we can either do percutaneous drainage or splenectomy. For mycotic aneurysm, which is the second important extracardiac complication, this mycotic aneurysm can form either intracerebrally in cerebral arteries or extracerebral. Now for extracerebral, we can go for surgical treatment, but we cannot do surgery in each and every case of intracerebral mycotic aneurysm. So for this, we will go for close monitoring. If the size is increasing, then definitely we can go for surgery. Now let's discuss the outcome of infective endocarditis. So firstly, adverse outcomes are associated with older age, severe comorbid conditions, and if a patient is diabetic, delay in diagnosis, prosthetic valve involvement or aortic valve involvement in cases of native valve, invasive pathogens like Staph aureus, which causes acute infective endocarditis, antibiotic resistant pathogens like Pseudomonas aeruginosa, yeast, intracardiac and major neurological complications, and healthcare associated infection which leads to resistant infections. When we consider survival rates in developed countries, these are around 80 to 90%. So these survival rates are 85 to 90% in cases of Streptococcus viridans, Haeckel group of organisms, Enterococci, because these bacilli, these bacteria are susceptible to synergistic treatment. But in case of Staph aureus, even in native valve endocarditis, the survival rate is only 55 to 70%, while in person who inject drugs, this survival rate is 85 to 90%. So Staph aureus infection in person who inject drugs is associated with good prognosis. When we consider prosthetic valve endocarditis, early prosthetic valve endocarditis, that is within 2 months of surgery, has a mortality of 40 to 50%, while late, which is more than 12 months after surgery, is associated with mortality of 10 to 20%. When we consider transcatheter aortic valve replacement in elderly, in hospital mortality is 35 to 50%. This means this condition is associated with very high risk of mortality if endocarditis develops, and at 1 year this mortality further increases to 60 to 75%. Let's come on to the prevention. So American Heart Association and European Society of Cardiology recommendations for prophylactic antibiotics for high risk patient is there. So these antibiotics are recommended only for high risk patients. What are the high risk patients? Who already have some heart disease and who are undergoing gingival tissue manipulation or manipulation of periapical teeth region, or the patients who have perforation of oral mucosa. So these are the conditions in which bacteremia can develop. So earlier clindamycin was also used for prophylaxis, but it is associated with increased risk of Clostridium difficile infection, therefore not used now. Now, should prophylaxis be given for every patient who is undergoing gastrointestinal or genitourinary procedure? No. It is not recommended for each and every patient. But if the patient has any gastrointestinal or genitourinary infection, this should be treated before the procedure. This should be treated completely before the procedure is undertaken. So who are at high risk individuals? In patients who already have mitral regurgitation, any congenital heart disease, aortic regurgitation, prosthetic valve, these are high risk individuals in which any cause of transient bacteremia can lead to infective endocarditis. It is important to note that if the patient has acute Q fever, the patient should be treated with doxycycline along with hydroxychloroquine for 12 months. This is highly effective in preventing infective endocarditis, which if developed is treated by same regimen for 18 to 24 months. 18 months for native valve and 24 months for prosthetic valve. Now, what all antibiotic regimens can be used for prophylaxis in adults with high risk cardiac lesions? We'll also discuss what are the high risk cardiac lesions. So, what is the standard oral regimen? Amoxicillin given 2 gram per orally 1 hour before any procedure. If the patient is unable to take orally, we can give ampicillin 2 gram intravenous or IM within 1 hour procedure. If the patient has penicillin allergy, we have three alternatives. We can either give macrolide, azithromycin 500 milligram per orally 1 hour before procedure, cephalexin 2 gram per orally 1 hour before procedure, or doxycycline 100 milligram per orally 1 hour before the procedure. What if patient have penicillin allergy, also is unable to take oral medication? Then also we have cefazolin or ceftriaxone, which can be given 1 gram IV or IM 30 minutes before the procedure. Now, what are the high risk cardiac lesions for which endocarditis prophylaxis is advised before any dental procedure? These include if the patient has implanted prosthetic valves or material, if there is implanted left ventricular assist devices or implantable heart, if patient already had prior endocarditis, any unrepaired cyanotic congenital heart disease including palliative shunts or conduit, completely repaired congenital heart defects during the 6 months after repair. That is, surgery has occurred within last 6 months. Repaired congenital heart disease with residual defects adjacent to prosthetic material, surgical or transcatheter pulmonary artery valve or conduit placement, valvulopathy developing after cardiac transplantation. So these are the high risk cardiac lesions for which prophylaxis has to be given. So with this, we have discussed almost each and every detail of this topic. I hope you like this lecture. Thank you so much, guys.